Hello, and before we begin, I'd like to do a quick audio test. So if you can, please type in the chat if you can hear me, and then we can get started. Perfect. Thank you all so much. So hello and welcome to today's webinar, Insights from Social Science on How to Navigate a Social Justice Issue. I do have a few housekeeping things to go over. I think we're all pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but if you do have any questions during the webinar, please type them in either the Q&A box or in the chat box. And we will try to get to those during the presentation if we feel like they're timely, or we will wait until the end and then we can get to those. Please connect with us using the hashtag MCCA webinar, and we will be sending a recording of this webinar to those that registered via the email you provided. Today's speaker is Dr. Omid Fatuhi, Director of Learning Innovation with WG Labs. And today's webinar is presented to us by WGU Labs. Sorry, hold on, my screen just went big. Let me get back to my script. WGU Labs invents, builds, and invests in learning solutions that are both innovative and effective with the aim to improve outcomes for learners everywhere. Building on research in social psychology and learning science, as well as industry trends, WGU Labs accelerates promising ed tech startups to develop educational resources and technology that are usable, effective, easy to implement, and ready to scale. By engaging learners in real-world settings, Labs tests for efficacy to ensure each product will positively impact student success. WGU Labs is a nonprofit affiliate of Western Governors University. Learn more about WGU Labs at wgulabs.org and follow us on Twitter at WGU Labs. And now I would like to introduce our speaker, which I have to admit, he is very impressive. So I do want to take my time and read his full bio. Dr. Fatuhi is a research psychologist exploring and researching the processes and scientific mechanisms underlying human motivation and performance, with the goal of empowering individuals to achieve their full potential. He is a research associate at the Learning Research and Development Center based at the University of Pittsburgh and the Director for Learning and Innovation at WGU Labs. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo. After which he worked at Stanford University, where he co-founded the College Transition Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institutional collaborations to deliver proven psychological interventions to over 40,000 students, as well as the Stanford Interventions Lab, a collaborative research group committed to sharing and scaling proven insights from psychology to promote better performance and well-being. He has led 45 professional development workshops across the United States to help students, faculty, leaders, athletes, and corporations better understand the psychology of success and equip those groups with the tools they need to perform at their full potential. I will now hand it over to our presenter, Dr. Fatuhi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Under normal circumstances, I would be able to see your faces and feed off the energy and the interactive conversations that help to get us a better understanding of some of the issues we'll cover today. With that, I do invite you to pose your questions in the chat. I think the moderators will try to either raise those questions and interrupt me as we go through, or if more relevant, we'll keep them towards the end and have a relatively interactive discussion at that point, which I think will be a really core part of our time today. I'm going to share with you some content, hopefully that will give us a better understanding of the issues we'll be discussing, but really the main component of where I want to spend my time with you is trying to discuss, explore, investigate, and strategize some of the tactics that we can employ around some of these issues that we'll be covering. So please allow me while I share my screen with you. and hopefully things go smoothly, but we'll jump in. Um, as you can see, the title of the talk today, and my hope for why you're here is to get a better understanding of some of the very sensitive, some of the very important issues that have impacted us over the past few months. And certainly COVID is one of those two things. But at the same time, there's also been this conversation, deep reflection around some of the issues related around race and identity and class in our nation and around the world. And it's been interesting to be part of this cultural event, phenomenon, this moment that we have all universally felt and have had to witness in unison. And in fact, because of COVID, there's actually been an opportunity for us to have a bit more of a moment of silence, if you will, to really witness and internalize and capture what has been going on and reflect on whether this is what we want to represent ourselves in this nation. With that, my own personal experience has certainly not been one of pure clarity. In fact, when, like most of you, I witnessed some of the videos and some of the news reporting around the issues of race and police violence, and a reflection and conversation around historical racism. There was a lot of emotions that were very strong inside of me. But I will say, more than anything, there was an emotion of ambivalence. There was an emotion of waiting. There was an emotion of hope that someone with more expertise, with more insight, with maybe more of a thoughtful, charismatic leadership role would step up and engage us as a nation and our communities around these difficult topics. And so I waited and I waited. And more than anything, what I witnessed was silence. And that silence, I think, in many ways actually impacted me more than the initial witnessing of the events. But then I began to wonder why it is that there is silence. And what I reflected on is the experiences that I was feeling that were making me wait. And as a social psychologist, I realized oftentimes that the answers that we look to understand the world around us has something to do with our own internal experiences of how we feel as an individual, that potentially what we feel is something that many others are feeling, and that at the level of the population, there is this effect. And the effect that I was noticing is an effect of inaction, an effect of silence in a time when there is a deep need for action and leadership. And so it was at that point that I was able to reflect on the literature in social psychology to try to understand why this was occurring. From my own perspective, as I mentioned, there was a hesitation to speak up, to comment on these issues, because I felt like I was not prepared or had the right credentials or even had the right skin color to give me the kind of personal experience that is needed to be able to comment on these very important, deep issues. But then I wondered if that set of experiences and that set of perceptions is what a lot of other people are feeling, especially those in positions of leadership. And lo and behold, certainly a review of the literature in psychology highlighted some instances where these kinds of inactive patterns of behavior were also quite apparent and quite striking at the same time. So what my hope today is essentially to target the causes of inaction and the impact of inaction, with the expectation that once we understand the forces that hold us back, we can actually overcome those forces and become more effective leaders and be able to facilitate the conversations that are needed in this time of unrest. And that is the focus of the conversation today. That is the focus of my talk. I hope to bring to you some insights from social psychology that will give us that unifying understanding of how we can take our own personal experiences and help to apply them in a way that leads to some healing in this time. I think at the core of many of the questions that we're all grappling with, we have repeatedly been exposed to patterns of injustice and inequity. And certainly when it comes to certain groups, there is long-standing historical and consistent patterns of inequity in our culture. When we look at the gaps between white and Black Americans in a number of domains, whether it be unemployment rates, whether it be the number of people who complete college, the household income, home ownership rates, imprisonment rates, and even life expectancy. There are these consistent gaps where some groups, in this case Black Americans, are experiencing poorer outcomes than their counterparts. And the question is why? Why is this happening? And hopefully we can get a better understanding of some of the answers for why this is happening. But what I don't want to do is again, get to a point where all of these difficult questions lead us to a place of inaction. And certainly, like myself, you all have probably heard a bit of a sentiment that those who are part of this community, part of this family, not be silent bystanders, as we all are witnessing these consistent inequities between our members of our populations, of our nation. And those who are hoping to become vocal and take a stand and impact change are compelling the rest of us not to be silent, not to be silent. And again, the question is, why is this occurring? Well, one of the factors, which I think is important to spend a minute on, is an understanding of how social media impacts our understanding of these complex issues, right? If you understand the algorithms that inform the content that is seen in your social media stream and feed, it is based purely on the algorithms that optimize the chances that you as an individual will click whatever content is made visible. Now, patterns and algorithms and lots of data show that you are more likely to click on the content if it is content that you agree with, that makes you feel good. And at the individual level, that doesn't seem that bad. But if you try to understand repeatedly what's happening in terms of the content that we're exposed to on these important issues, you'll understand that social media actually has this critical role of filtering what we are exposed to, creating a simplified narrative of these often complex issues, and usually a narrative that is polarized, a narrative that is divisive, instead of one that helps to understand the other side. And one of the forces that does compel us to feel so strongly and potentially not open-minded to the other side is what we've been exposed to through the algorithms that our social media platforms have fed us. And indeed, when you look at the way that these complex issues are portrayed and discussed on every level, there seems to be a counter narrative around similar issues, right? If it has to do with equality of outcomes, one side will say we have to equalize the outcomes, while the other side says it's about equality of opportunity. While one group will say it's about structural racism, the other group will say it's about cultures and values and individual choice. While one group may say collective action is what's needed, another group will say it's about individual responsibility, and so on and so forth. And that is part of what makes this conversation so difficult. That's what feels like we're not able to be heard by the other side, because every point that we raise based on the kinds of narratives that we've been exposed to, when we try to express it, we find that there's a wall that has an equal counter narrative around the same issues. So this is a barrier. This is an obstacle. It's a point of contention. Now, as I mentioned, my hope today is to share with you the same insights that have helped me get a better understanding of these complex issues, that have also compelled me to be here with you, to stick my neck out and talk about issues that are potentially contentious, that I may make a mistake on, or that I may not be the most expert, and yet I still believe that engaging in these conversations, because of the insights that social psychology have given me, is the thing that needs to be done, which is why I'm here with you today. And my hope is that the same insights that have helped me be here, I can share with you so that you can then engage in your communities and engage in the leadership that is very much needed at this time. When we look to social psychology, in fact, there have been instances where apparently mind-boggling patterns of behaviors that seemingly seem unexplainable are indeed explained by social psychology. Whether it be domains of conformity, compliance, or bystander effects, we have been puzzled by some findings in social psychology, but then an exploration and a series of investigations have helped us understand the underpinnings for why we've observed these things. A few quick examples. In experiments of conformity, what they do is they invite participants into a small lab room, and unbeknownst to the participant, they're actually sitting in a group of a number of other individuals, and the other individuals are actually paid actors. And they tell the participant that you're about to complete a survey. So they put the survey on the desk in front of them, and they say, please start filling out the survey. And the other confederates, the other actors, similarly pretend like they're filling out the survey. So they sit through and they began to fill out the survey. And as the experiment begins, there's actually a hose that comes through the door in a neighboring room that starts to feed smoke into the survey room, into the lab room. And this basically experiment will continue to feed smoke into the lab room until the participant speaks up. Now, you might expect that if you're sitting in a room and you see smoke, the natural reaction would be to maybe stand up, to ask someone else to see what's going on, and to get out of there, because smoke is not usually a sign of a good thing. Now, what's interesting is that in these experiments, the participants, when they look around at the actors that are in the room with this individual, and they see that the actors are not doing anything, they too will proceed to sit there and complete the survey until the room is entirely filled with smoke, to the point where they have to swat the smoke away to see the survey in front of them. And you might be wondering, why in the world would anyone do this? Or even, would I do that in that situation? And when you start to understand the root cause for why someone might do this, then you start to think, well, maybe it's possible that I might also do that. And essentially, these experiments have revealed that the reason why people don't stand up is because they look around and they see all these other people. And what all these other people are doing is nothing. And so at that point, even though you as a participant are observing the smoke coming through, you start to question yourself. You start to question whether you might have some input or some comment that is more valuable or knowledgeable than all of the other people in the room. In fact, the more people there are who do nothing, the less likely you are to do something. And it was really this kind of research that made me wonder if there's something similar happening in our society today as it relates to these conversations around race and racism and identity and class. That maybe this observation of inaction among others is causing us to also feel like maybe we are not the right experts, or that we know something that is of value to contribute to this conversation. And if that is the case, that's potentially not optimal, because if the action that's required is one of speaking up and representing and facilitating discussion, then that is leaving the rest of the population that is in need of that dialogue and those engagements to feel like they are being neglected. Another example, which sort of brings me back to my early days in my graduate program, was this observation of the rates of organ donation by country. Now, this seemingly simple graph shows that different countries have starkly different rates of organ donation, with some countries being in the low 4%, 10%, 17%, and other countries almost hitting that ceiling effect. And so you might wonder, what is the difference between these two countries that leads to these incredibly different outcomes when it comes to something as important as donating your organs after you no longer need them, potentially saving the lives of others? What is it that is making some groups, some countries consistently donate and other countries not? You might wonder, well, maybe it has something to do with the values or the culture. But interestingly enough, again, social psychology has had incredible potential to give us the insights for what is actually happening. And in these experiments, or in these studies, what they found was that the difference between these countries that have these really low rates of donation and these countries that have really high rates of donation has nothing to do with individual factors and almost everything to do with the way that the message is framed. So as it turns out, when is it that you go and decide whether to donate your organs? It's usually when you're filling out your driver's license, and at the back of the license is a question that says, do you want to donate your organs or not? And it turns out that the way that that question is framed is critical, because in countries where the question is framed as check here if you do want to donate, then most people do not check that box. And in the countries where the question is framed as check here if you do not want to donate, again, the pattern of behavior is the same. Most people do not check that box. As it turns out, the reason for this is that when it comes to an important decision, like donating your organ, potentially saving a life, asked at a moment where you're not quite certain what to do, the default action is to wait and do nothing. The default is to say that maybe later I'll come back to this when I have more clarity and more certainty. But recognizing the power of default, those who do nothing, and the question is framed as, do you want to donate your organs, end up having these really low rates of donation. Whereas those, again, who do nothing, but the question is framed as, do you not want to donate, also delay that decision, but as a consequence, become organ donors. Now, as we're talking about these difficult, important questions in circumstances of uncertainty, I think we're all sort of experiencing something similar. When we're talking about race and racism, there are so many dimensions that we are exposed to and impacted and expected to absorb and understand that it's not surprising to see again that same experience of uncertainty. And the question is, how is it impacting us? Well, what I'll submit to you is that the impact is similar to what I've demonstrated in the other study, is that the impact leads us to a default of inaction. Now, again, my hope is to potentially share with you some unifying model that gives us a better understanding of how some of these forces actually interact, giving us the power to intervene in this cycle so that when we target either beliefs or structures or behaviors, that we're disrupting the patterns that lead to inequitable outcomes. And my proposition here is that these outcomes really are linked, that the individual level forces that impact our perceptions lead to outcomes at the individual level that when aggregated across a population lead to patterns and structures that create systems of inequity. And so what do? Well, we can target any level of these issues, hopefully beginning with the individual level. Now, as I mentioned, when we observe these patterns of inequity, the question might be, why is this happening? And certainly there are some individuals who have the tendency to come up with the narratives or the explanations that there are potentially these individual innate genetic differences for why some people might have these different outcomes. In fact, we've seen this not too long ago in our recent history where differences in women's math potential was explained by some people in leadership as these innate differences. But when, again, we looked to social psychology, we have a different perspective. So in a set of experiments pioneered by Claude Steele, what they did is in trying to understand potentially what is the root cause for these inequitable outcomes of performance between men and women, for instance, in certain domains like STEM and mathematics, they invited men and women into the lab and they told these participants that they're about to do a relatively difficult part of the math GREs. Now, for half these participants, what they did was basically just lay it out as I just mentioned. Now, for the other half, what they did was to add one additional comment, which was that although we recognize that math tests like these in the past may have shown gender differences, guess what? In this particular test, for whatever reason, we do not find those gender differences. So go ahead and give it your best try and we'll see what happens. And so the same test given to basically the same group who were matched on skill and interest in mathematics, with the only difference being what they framed the potential differences in test scores for one group versus the other, actually led to a confirmation of what's known as the achievement gap. That men and women who are matched on the skills, that means that if you were to look at their performance on paper before they came into the lab, would have been equivalent. And yet they come into the lab, they do the same test, and on the left in the control condition, you see that men are outperforming the women for whatever reason that they were exposed to within that situation. That is the consistent achievement gap that we observe. Now, in the other condition where they framed it as there not being a difference in this test historically, the women and the men perform equally well. Now, the question again is, why is this? If there is something innate that's immutable, you would not expect this difference between the two groups. But if there's something within the context, potentially, that leads to different experiences and perceptions of what the test means to you and what the context means about your place of belonging and value, then potentially that might impact your ability to focus, your ability to feel at ease, your ability to perform under pressure. And that's exactly what's observed, that there are forces in the context that impact individual level experiences that lead to these apparent differences in outcomes. And this work actually led to the development of what's known as stereotype threat. That the notion that there are negative perceptions about you or your group in the culture, in the context, might impact how you feel about yourself in that situation. If you feel like others are going to negatively view you, then that anxiety and that uncertainty looms large in your mind and actually sucks up some of the cognitive resources needed for you to be able to focus on the task at hand. And instead of being calm and at ease, you're wondering, I wonder if others think I'm going to fail. I wonder if others expect that I'm not going to do well. I wonder if others think I belong here. And that cognitive noise, that talk, is taking you away from what's needed, which is to focus on the task at hand. And that is the cause for why these inequitable outcomes occur. I'm going to share with you a video, and hopefully you can hear the audio here. But this is a video of Muhammad Ali in an interview where he just happens to be talking about some patterns that he's observed.
Things are getting much better, but I always wondered when I went to church on Sundays. I've always been one to, I'm not just a boxer. I do a lot of reading, a lot of studying. I ask questions. I travel these countries and watch how their people live, and I learn. And I always ask my mother, I said, Mother, how come is everything white? I said, why is Jesus white with blonde and blue eyes? Why is the Lord's Supper all white men? angels of like Pope and Mary and even the angels. I said, Mother, when we die, do we go to heaven? She said, naturally we go to heaven. I said, well, what happened to all the black angels they took the pictures? I said, oh, I know. If the white folks was in heaven too, then the black angels were in the kitchen preparing the milk and honey. I said, listen, you quit saying that, boy. I was always curious, and I always wondered why I had to die to go to heaven. Why I couldn't have pretty cars and good money and nice homes now? Why do I have to wait till I die to get milk and honey? And I said, Mama, I don't want no milk and honey. I like steaks and I said, milk and honey is a laxative anyway. Do they have a lot of bathrooms in heaven?
So hopefully you were able to hear that. Sometimes the audio doesn't come through, but interestingly enough, I think what that short clip is demonstrating is that if you are part of a group and consistently you notice that there are these cultural narratives, these cultural portrayals of you or your group or even other groups that's somehow distinct, over time, don't you think that would make you question whether you belong, whether you are part of this ideal portrayal of this society and this culture? And that over time, what does that do in terms of your experiences of being at psychological ease, of feeling like you can integrate and have access to the same opportunities? This is one of the questions that we're going to address.
Things are getting much better.
And how we're going to address that is actually by beginning with, again, this topic of the individual perceptions. One of the hesitations I have is to paint with broad strokes that an entire culture is prejudiced or evil. But what I'm less hesitant to do is to talk about some of the perceptual patterns that we have in common. And when it comes to bias, especially implicit bias, there is some very compelling evidence showing that we all experience different kinds of moments in similar ways, even though we may not be aware of those. And one of the biases that I'll submit to you for your consideration is that potentially that there are these biases about groups that we have either been exposed to or internalized and accepted potentially even to a certain degree, even though we may be as proactive and well-intentioned as you can imagine. That maybe there are still these cultural narratives that we've absorbed at some level that may have the basis for patterns that lead to these inequitable outcomes. What you see here is a sort of a caricature that captures this. So the police officers have stopped this man of color, and you say that you look like the sketch of someone who's thinking about committing a crime. And that feeds into a stereotype that I think we all have at least contemplated, that Black individuals potentially have more criminality associated with them. That the stereotype of Black as criminal is something that we have experienced, whether it be something that we've heard and actively disagree with, or it be something that we experience and feel as we walk down the street and coming our way as a tall Black man. And our internal experience is one of maybe reluctance, of anxiety. And even though we try to overcome that and override that with our rational thought that maybe there's something there, or that we fully buy into it, that there are these group differences where some people are more prone. And where you fall along that spectrum is not as important as the fact that this stereotype is out there and that we all are exposed to it. And that in some way, potentially, it might impact us in some ways. So some brilliant research by Jennifer Eberhardt and her team tries to see if we can measure the impact of these biases. And what you're going to see on your screen here is sort of a grayed out, blurry picture of an object. Now, in the study, what they do is they ask people to indicate the moment at which they are able to clearly identify what that object is. And initially, it begins with the object being quite blurry and unclear, but then as the sequence progresses, it becomes clearer and clearer. And the question is, at what point are you able to identify the object clearly? Now that in itself is an interesting study, but what they do in these series of experiments is that they have two conditions where in one condition, individuals before seeing the image that goes from being very blurry to clearer are exposed to either a white face or a black face. And what they find is that being exposed to the black face before seeing the sequence of images actually leads people to identify the picture as a gun more quickly than those who are exposed to the picture of the individual with the white face. And what that conveys is that, again, in our minds, there is this association between criminality and black, that once we have black activated, that we are more quick to associate criminality with patterns, even though the patterns are obscure. It also impacts where you look. And again, Jennifer Eberhardt and her team have demonstrated that showing stimuli on the screen at different places after, and then indicating where people see a moving dot, if they have the location of the black face in one spot and the location of the white face in another spot, that then being asked to identify where the dot is, that people identify it more quickly when the dot and the object that's associated with some sort of crime are in the same location, but are more slow to identify where the dot is, where there's that disjointed connection, where there's either a black face and a non-criminal object or a white face and a criminal object. And again, this not only shows that we are more quick to make associations between certain stereotypes about black individuals and criminality, but also a tendency of where we might look for to confirm our presuppositions of expectations that we have. Now, what I've done is convey to you the patterns of bias that impact individuals. What happens when we aggregate these individual patterns to a population level? This is what we'll talk about next. In a series of experiments, researchers sent out about 5,000 CVs or resumes to job applications. Now, these were not real resumes, but they were identical. And the only thing that they changed or differed in these applications was the name that appeared at the top of the application. And the name was either a white sounding name or a black sounding name. And again, everything else was identical. And what they wanted to know was, what would be the rates of response to the same identical set of resumes, given that the only thing that differs is the name on the resume? And what they found was that the white sounding names received about 50% more callbacks, all things being equal. As I mentioned, bias is something that we potentially are all impacted by. And in moments of ambiguity, in moments of critical decisions, maybe we engage in decisions or behaviors that at the population level lead to some systemic differences. And certainly these studies have been replicated over and over again. When we look at the biases in mortgage lending, we again find that there is this gap, that individuals in one set of studies who are black have to make about $125,000 to be getting the same levels of denial rates as individuals who are white and make about $25,000 per year in income. Essentially what that means is that when left to the subjective decisions of the bank lenders, two people coming into the bank who they are placed in a position of gauging risk, absent any other information, tend to make the information that is consistent with that notion that there's greater risk with certain groups compared to others, demonstrated by this massive gap in the commensurate income levels that's required to be able to get a mortgage. You also find that there tends to be segregation in terms of neighborhoods. Where do people congregate? Well, it turns out that they congregate and buy homes around neighborhoods where they see others like themselves, whether by choice or by force. Now, this may be an interesting observation. There could be a lot of reasons for why this is, but the impact is one that's noteworthy. Because in America, the way that the school systems are funded is basically across this distribution, where there's a large majority of the funding that comes from local taxes, basically the neighborhoods that you find yourself in. About 45% come from local taxes, about 45% come from state taxes, and about 5 to 10% come from federal level funding. Now, if you understand that the vast majority of the funding comes from the neighborhoods that you come from, then you also are able to see why individuals going to public schools will have support that ranges from about $9,000 per student per year to about $29,000 per student per year. And if you're a child who's expected to go to a school where the funding for you is about $9,000, you can imagine the kinds of resources, the books, technology, the quality of teaching, the quality of the physical environments that you have to be exposed to repeatedly and then expected to learn, compared to someone who has about $29,000 a year per student. And so as we're wondering, well, what are the causes of these performance gaps that seem to stem from early ages? Potentially, some of these systemic biases in terms of where people choose to live might impact the kinds of outcomes that are available to different groups. We also see this in disciplinary action, that individuals who are Black children are about 4 times as likely to be disciplined than white children. When you translate this to lifetime likelihood of imprisonment, and what I'll get you to look at is the difference between white men and Black men, that about 1 in 17 white men have a likelihood of being imprisoned at some point, whereas it's about 1 in 3 for Black men. You start to wonder where these systemic causes of inequitable outcome might stem from. Now, we've gone through and uncovered some of the individual level biases that impacts our perceptions. I've alluded to some patterns that might reflect what's happening when those individual level patterns aggregate or generalize to population level. Now what I want to do is actually circle back to the individual level, but this time from the perceptions of the humanity and belonging that we have in these interactions, the human perspective. I'll share with you a story that I had to go through. Being from Iran, born in Iran, but then migrating to North America when I was relatively young, I still show that I was born in Iran on my passport. And during some time after 9/11, I was going through the airport. And as I was going through, one of the customs agents, as he takes my passport, scans my face, scans my passport, looks through my stuff, then pauses and proceeds to ask, without any other basis or any other pretext, proceeds to ask, "Are you a terrorist?" by looking me square in the eyes. Now, as a traveler who's trying to get either home or to a meeting, I can't remember, and encountering this questioning that's coming from an authority figure at a moment when I was not expecting it, filled me with a range of emotions, from uncertainty to fear to complete anger, but one of ultimately feeling like I was less than, somehow less human, by having to be subjected to this questioning, and that there was nothing I could do, that there are these forces and these cultures and these structures in place where I was required to answer to these kinds of questions without justification. Now, fortunately for me, I was able to use my class privilege, pull out my student card, and use some vernacular that demonstrated some level of competence in academics, and wiggle my way out of that pretty tense situation. But I'm not sure that's available to everybody. Nonetheless, having even been able to get out of that situation, it left me with a deep scar that to this day, when I pass through the security of an airport, I wonder, will I still have to be subjected to that same kind of experience? And that's top of mind every single time. And that for me was a single incident. It was a one-time experience. But if you are someone who is repeatedly exposed to these kinds of encounters and questionings and wondering whether you belong and are a valid and esteemed member of this group in the society, what kind of impact does that have for you at the individual level? And certainly I think by now you're alluding to the fact that the questions of belonging that we all have may loom larger for you. You start to wonder, is this somewhere where I belong? Is this somewhere where I'm valued? Is this a place where others esteem me and my contributions? Or does it violate my basic needs of safety and the need to perceive that this is a just world? And potentially feeds into an outrage for being viewed as less than or dangerous, even though that's not part of your history or profile. In some other work, what they've demonstrated is that there really is this component of dehumanization that occurs at the aggregate level, at the population level, that again, post 9/11, individuals, primarily white Americans, were asked to rate how evolved individuals from different groups are. And what they found was that, consistent with the stereotype groups at the time, that people from the Muslim or the Arab world and groups were rated as being less evolved than other groups, less human than other groups, because of the narratives that loomed large, that were in the air, that gave individuals the basis to start to question that maybe there are these differences that occur. And this dehumanization, from the dehumanizing perspective, those who are dehumanizing others, is also associated with support for restrictive policies like Muslim bans, a greater tendency for support and agreement for aggression towards the Muslim world, and a generalization to the whole group, that it's Muslims that are a potential cancer to this country, agreements with statements like that, or the attacks on San Bernardino prove it. Muslims are a threat to the people of this country. And incidentally, in this study, they also found greater support for Trump, for a greater likelihood of dehumanizing. Now, what does it feel like to be on the receiving end of this dehumanizing effect? Well, if you feel that there are moments where you are potentially seen as less than, then you feel like you're disliked by Trump in particular, that you're disliked more generally by Americans, that also leads to greater support for hostile responses as a reaction to this inequity, and an unwillingness to cooperate with the existing structures to engage in proactive and pro-social kinds of behaviors of cultural responsibility. I'm going to share with you again another video that conveys from the individual perspective what that must feel like to be exposed to this kind of cultural experience repeatedly. And this is James Baldwin, who is an American novelist who has been a longtime commentator on the issues of inequity in our culture. And this is an interview where he's asked to say or to comment about what it feels like to be Black. What is this image that you feel is portrayed of you and your group? And here's what he has to say.
What is he? I don't know what white people see, when they look at a Negro anymore. But I do know very well that I realized when I was very young that whatever he was looking at, it wasn't me.
So this feeling that there's a dehumanization, that somehow you're viewed in a way that's different than how you see yourself, that at the individual level impacts a lot of individuals. And so hopefully what I've done is created some portrayal that links how individual perceptions lead to cultural and systemic patterns of behavior that leads to outcomes and experiences for certain groups that make them question their sense of humanity and their sense of belonging. What I want to do now is to potentially leave you with some more optimistic solutions. And I want to convey quite clearly that this understanding of how these things interact is part of the solution. That when we understand that there are forces that even from an innocent perspective can impact patterns, then we can be more clear, more confident when we do speak about these issues. And so that's one goal. And the other goal is, again, to look at the end target of the outcome that we care about. If at the end of all of these issues, one of the experiences is one of feeling dehumanized and that you don't belong, then the solution is also centered around creating experiences that helps to rehumanize and create greater belonging for all individuals from all groups. And so recognizing that the need to belong is a fundamental need, which is different than a desire, because when one of your core needs, like your hunger and safety, is threatened, that causes a disruption and prevents you from the normal functioning that you need to be able to operate in any domain. And so when your need to belong is disrupted, then you can't function in normal ways. That's just important to recognize that that's different than wanting to belong. And that there is change that you can believe in, right? And in fact, believing in change is potentially the prerequisite for being able to have the change that we want. So in a series of studies, they actually find that the degree that we view intelligence as something that is fixed and immutable impacts how we feel about engaging in these difficult conversations, whether we feel uncomfortable, whether we feel that it will be diagnostic, that it will convey to others that we are racist, whether it will upset others, or whether we see prejudice as something that can be changed and that maybe is something that we all experience from time to time in varying degrees and that we might be impacted by in varying degrees without that necessarily equating to us being this labeled racist. And I bring this up because I think this is one of the forces that we all have had to grapple with, haven't we? Especially if we're not part of the Black group, who is the focus of a lot of these conversations. If you're not a Black American, how can you speak about these issues? How can you lead? How can you engage? And the fear of doing so, I think in part, is a worry that if you do say something, that will reveal that you are racist. But as my hope have conveyed, the inaction that comes from the uncertainty and the anxiety might actually be more harmful. And you may say something that isn't right, you may make a mistake, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are racist. And confronting that balance, that tension that we all have, is part of the effort. It's part of the solution. We all have to do that deep reflection and say, we have all inherited and have been exposed and impacted by the cultural narratives and the biases that we all share and the patterns that we're all a part of. But that being part of that group or being part of that experience does not necessarily make you an immutable, unchangeable racist. And engaging in conversations that are difficult does not pose you at risk for being seen as such. And that is part of the solution. The other part of the solution is that, as leaders, and I borrow this graph from some common leadership seminars that I've been exposed to, we can't necessarily change the beliefs or the behaviors of individuals, but what we can do is create the opportunities and the experiences that allows individuals to foster the kinds of beliefs that are consistent with the opportunities that they're exposed to. And so as leaders, if we don't create the opportunities for engagement and dialogue and discussion, then we're leaving ourselves prey to letting social media impact beliefs and impact actions and impact results. So if there's one thing that we can do as leaders, is we can create the experiences that then lead to these beliefs and actions and results that we hope for. And that One of the best ways that we can do that, which I think has two components. One component is certainly to speak up about these issues, whether to take a stand and be vocal and be visible about where justice should lie, but not to stop there. In fact, not to just tout these beliefs and these opinions, but rather to invite two-way conversation, to invite two-way dialogue, to create the space for difficult discussion. Because without that, if you are, again, part of that group that feels potentially dehumanized and you're being talked at without ever being given the opportunity to be heard, that's not going to create the fundamental need to be seen as human or to feel like you belong. That only happens when you create dialogue, two-way, meaningful, authentic dialogue. The other thing that I think is important to do is to normalize that many of these conversations will be uncomfortable. And that's okay. Discomfort does not mean that you're saying something wrong. In fact, in order for us to make progress, to understand the other side, that we have to expose ourselves to information that we may not have been aware of, ready for, or that we can easily process in terms of the kinds of structures we have in our minds. But that's okay. In fact, discomfort is potentially an indication that we're making progress. So you as leaders can actually create the cultural norm that discomfort is not a bad thing, but rather is a necessary part of the process for us to really engage with each other around these difficult conversations. And that there is no clear right answer. I think there is a tendency for us to have the right answer as leaders, but we may not have the answers. And again, that's okay. But if we're part of the conversation and we create the space for dialogue, then that's the best thing that potentially we can do. And then to be proactive, as I mentioned, because if you're not proactive, if you're not engaged, if you're not being and creating an agent of initiation, of action, of opportunity and dialogue, then you, as I mentioned, are letting social media do it for you. And what social media does, unfortunately, is that it creates polarized views that are disjointed and separate. So I think what I want to do with that is pause there, open it up for questions. I'd love to hear what you all are experiencing. Are there worries that you're navigating? Do you feel encouraged by this conversation to try? And also to reach out. If you have any questions, I'm happy to engage with any of you. I have some presence on social media, though not as active as I'd like. And the best way to get a hold of me is by email. So with that, I'll stop here and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. And we do have a couple questions. Let me get to them. Okay, hold on just a second. So guilty until proven innocent as opposed to innocent until proven guilty. Do you agree that is a bias that exists with minority individuals?
I am not a social justice expert. And so when it comes to innocence and guilt, it's not part of my expertise. I certainly don't feel like I'm qualified to comment on that dimension. My expertise comes in trying to understand the factors and the forces that motivates individuals. And again, as you take individual patterns of behaviors and you aggregate them across the population, you find patterns that do impact all of us. This notion of labeling people as innocent or guilty, I think actually even touches on one of the last topics that I mentioned, the research showing our beliefs about whether people are either one thing or another. Are they prejudiced or not? Are they guilty or not? Are they racist or not? My challenge to you is that maybe there's some work that can be done in trying to understand that that perception impacts how we engage. And if we go into a situation with the mindset that people are either guilty or innocent, prejudiced or not, potentially we're not opening ourselves up to the authentic conversation that's needed. And certainly I think to your point or to your question, I don't want to disregard it. Are there stereotypes of certain groups? Absolutely. Do I believe that individuals can be guilty and racist? Absolutely. But that association isn't always a one-to-one. And therein lies, I think, the power for us to see where we can employ some really effective processes, communication, and efforts to create opportunities to allow people to challenge that notion of each other. If we invite people into a conversation and dialogue and try to convey to them that above all else, we are human, that we are part of this community, part of this institution, that we share the goals of trying to learn and to add contribution to our society, and that there are these issues that we all commonly grapple with, potentially from different perspectives. Hopefully that will be the basis for the conversation that leads to more fruitful and more healing that is needed and that there's a craving for at this time.
Thank you. Here's our next question. When looking at taxes in an area, would you say that census work for funding distribution federally and statewide, gerrymandering, which leads to systematic redlining, and gentrification can lead to both pros and cons for minority communities? Many refuse to fill out census work due to the questions asked, do not vote due to feeling unheard by society, and many who have intergenerational ties to a community cannot afford to stay in an area due to raising costs, though schooling funds increase.
Right. Again, amazing questions, and I'm wondering if I'm disappointing you by deferring to others who are more expert in this domain when it comes to the politics of how election processes play out. In fact, I'll admit that I'm actually a Canadian and I'm still learning about the American electoral process with mixed feelings. But I think, again, I come back to how is it that messaging within the context impacts individual perceptions, right? I think if there are cues or barriers or obstacles, there's a ton of research from behavioral economics that shows that even seemingly small burdens or barriers can become huge barriers to access, especially for groups that tend to already be grappling with a lot of stress and difficulty and challenge, right? So this notion of scarcity is something that impacts all of us, but some to a greater extent. If you are someone who is expected to support your family, someone who is expected to go to school, someone who is expected to take care of your children and in current times also manage their learning. And at the same time, you're expected to get out and vote, but that voting station is somewhere that's out of, within the realms of you being able to get there easily. And you don't feel like people like you are showing up to vote, that certainly will have an impact. That certainly adds to the burden and the tax that helps you gauge, is this something that is worth me investing my time into? And if at the aggregate level, those deterrents add to enough burden or enough scarcity, then you will find these patterns of inhibition. Whether they also help to promote certain patterns of engagement, I think the same is true, but ultimately, anything that leads to a lightening of the cognitive and psychological taxes that creates slack rather than create scarcity is one that will promote action. And so if you're trying to design policies, the question that you might want to ask yourself from a social psychological perspective is, how do I free up people's mental and cognitive bandwidth and ease the channels towards action so that when people do want to take action, they can.
Thank you. I've heard Black Americans say that Black people cannot be racist. Does racism, bigotry, and prejudice all lead to the same place in terms of how people treat one another with bias?
Also a very important question. And again, I will comment tentatively, which is that even the notion of racism is I'm not sure that I have a clear definition on. And that, in fact, I've conducted some workshops where in a poll, I've asked people to define what racism is. Not being an expert, I actually was authentically curious to know how to define racism. And I got as many responses as there were individuals. And so if we're going to talk about what racism is, I think one of the things that we're still not super clear on is how it's defined by. That's one thing that helps me sort of not directly answer that question, and I apologize for not directly answering it, but I just don't know that I have the clarity from my own personal experience to have the confidence to comment on what racism is, because rather than insights on what racism necessarily is, we do have insights on what biases are that again lead to these perceptual differences. Whether that then leads to motivated and intentional patterns of prejudice that are combined with power and structures, I think these are great conversations and great questions that we need to explore from a social justice perspective, from a policy perspective. And absolutely, I'm happy to be part of those conversations to the extent that social science can help us understand them. But whether I can make a claim about what the right approach is, I'm not sure that I'm that right person. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Our next question, do you have any interactive group activities that you would recommend to address racism with nursing students?
Yeah, and not necessarily nursing students. I think just any students in general, right? I think one of the facets that I've mentioned is this worry that you as an individual from a certain group may not be seen as someone who belongs, or as someone who is equally human even as the rest of the group. And one of the things that creates that distinction or that disassociation between one and another, especially in traditional systems and structures where there's differences and dynamics of power, like a teacher and a student, there are these implicit norms around what your experience is like compared to mine. And one of the things that students commonly experience is that you, as someone who is in a place of authority, have probably arrived at that place of authority and success through a series of sequences of success after success after success. And that you've had no challenges or uncertainties that have sort of colored or impacted your trajectory. And how we can potentially shatter that or put that into question is to convey our own humanity, our own challenges, our own uncertainties, our own willingness to engage with students, not in this formal role as me as teacher and you as someone that I will evaluate, but rather me as a partner in our journey of learning. That together we are in this together. I hope to learn as much from you as hopefully you can learn from me, and that ultimately what matters is not the grade that you get, but rather what we get out of this experience and our time together. And I encourage you to engage with me. I encourage you to recognize that we're all learning and that we all have challenges, and to normalize the uncertainties that you have had is one of the powerful things that you can do to allow students to engage around these certain issues and topics, right? Because if they feel like you care, then even around difficult topics, they'll be less hesitant to reach out to you, because they don't think that all that you value is their performance. They know that you see them for their whole selves, right? And ultimately, that's what matters. They want to feel like someone values them, someone feels like they belong in this context, and you as a faculty, as a leader, create the experiences and opportunities that allows individuals to feel that or not.
Thank you. And our next question, we are beginning these uncomfortable conversations about race with faculty and staff on a predominantly white campus. I am getting a lot of silence from whites and Black people. Any ideas on how to create a safe space via Zoom?
Yeah, and certainly there isn't necessarily a right answer for all groups in all contexts, but one of the things I would convey is potentially breaking away from that perception that you as a leader are there to convey what's right and what's wrong. And if you can do that and invite people to, a conversation where the intent is for you to hear from individuals in your community what their experiences are, what their questions are, what their challenges are, what you're able to do is to mitigate and minimize that tension that whatever they have to say has to be the right thing. Instead, if you say that what I care about are your experiences, and no one's experience can be right or wrong because it is their experience and your questions, then you are able to invite really meaningful dialogue. And hopefully you can also invest the time to really listen, right? I think as leaders, we have this temptation to solve, but sometimes that comes across as not allowing people to be part of the conversation. And so if you're going to create a Zoom platform, a Zoom conversation, make sure that you frame it as, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, I'm here to try to capture your experiences, because you all are the experts of what it's like to be a member of this community on our campus from your group and your perspective. And I will never have that kind of insight like you do. So I not only invite you, but I implore you to come and help me understand. And when you can create that authentic perception that you value their perceptions, and there's not one of discussion or debate around what's right and wrong, then you're able to mitigate the silence. Then you're able to reduce the anxieties that there has to be the right thing to say, or the worry that you might say the wrong thing, which is at the heart of why we're seeing silence. You're also, when it comes to the Black individuals who you might invite, sometimes being too directive and asking them to show up can be burdensome, right? If you've been asked to be the expert on these complex topics simply because of the color of your skin, may or may not be something that you want, and it can be taxing. And so when you reach out to groups, make sure that you're not saying, hey, can you come and facilitate this dialogue around race because of the skin of your color? And make sure that it is inviting people to be part of a conversation of a community around the very many differences that make us similar. That's what I would say to that.
Thank you very much. And one of the people that had the questions that you said, you didn't feel comfortable, you'd give your opinion, but you didn't feel comfortable answering. And you said hope you didn't disappoint her. And she said, no disappointment at all. And I agree. I think your response was right on the money. So I don't see any more questions, but please feel free to continue typing them in as I'll read, in case anyone missed it, the message from our sponsor today, which is WGU Labs. They invent, build, and invest in learning solutions that are both innovative and effective with the aim to improve outcomes for learners everywhere. Building on research in social psychology and learning science, as well as industry trends, WGU Labs accelerates promising ed tech startups to develop educational resources and technology that are usable, effective, easy to implement, and ready to scale. By engaging learners in real-world settings, lab tests for efficacy to ensure each product will positively impact student success. WGU Labs is a nonprofit affiliate of Western Governors University. Learn more about WGU Labs at wgulabs.org and follow them on Twitter at WGU Labs. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure. I'm so glad that you and WGU Labs connected with us. We scheduled this how long ago? About a year ago. And so now we're finally here to present it. And I couldn't be more thrilled. So thank you very much. I don't think I see any more questions, not yet, but I'll keep looking at those. So if you still have questions, please feel free to type them in, and we have a couple more minutes to get to them. But I will start to wrap things up. We do have some upcoming events that we would like to share. Dr. Patuhi has been so gracious to provide 2 more extremely valuable webinars for us. Strength in Numbers, Insights and Strategies on How to Weather the COVID Storm in Community Colleges will be on September 22nd at 10 a.m. At Central Standard Time, and the Psychology of Student Success on October 14th at 10 a.m. So be sure to register for those and look for notifications. We will send those out. And we also have a webinar coming up next week, Making Community Colleges Democracies Colleges. Again, a roundtable discussion. So some of you did have questions about voting. So that will be a voter engagement webinar, and that will be next Wednesday, September 16th at 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Again, we did record today's webinar, and so we will be sending that out via email. Oh, Carla did have one more thing to say. I have recently attended another webinar on this topic. This was beneficial and informational. Yes, and I love the conversations that came out of it. I highly agree, Carla. So I don't see any more questions. So with that, oh, yes, we did record, Martha, so we will, the slides will be in the presentation, so you will get those. Thank you for that question. Good, that's a good point. So if there are no more questions, we will let everyone go. Thank you again, Dr. Patuhi. It was an honor to have you present to us today, and we can't wait to see your next 2 webinars.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you all, and have a great day.
Be well.